Hi everyone, so today we'll be building a very simple multiple choice quiz app that looks something like this on the left. So in this video, we'll be working through the HTML and CSS part. If you're interested in watching the JavaScript part, feel free to click on the link in the description below. So let's go through briefly as to how the quiz app looks like so we can start working on the HTML and CSS. So on the first page, there should be a heading title that says the simple quiz, and then there should be some sort of instructions, and then a get started button. Once you get into the main quiz page, there should be a timer on the top left, showing the questions below that, and a progress bar on the left. There should be the actual question and the 4 different options. Check answer button, and once you've checked that or the time's up, there should be a next question button and a quick quiz button on every single question. So once we get to the end of the quiz, there should be a score page, which is very similar to the first page. All right, let's get started with the coding part of the HTML. As you can see, I've opened up a very basic HTML with some sort of template, and I've connected up the CSS file and also the JavaScript file. So let's get started with the HTML. First, give a main class of border radius, which we'll create later on in CSS. We'll start off with the header. Give the header a class of padding and margin, which we will also be creating later. H1 tag, and that's the title. Heading, and we move on to the second container, which has a class of timer. And then we have a H4 text that's showing the time left, surrounded by the span because we'll be able to change that later. Moving on to the Get Started page, starting a new section. Once we get started, we will create a if class container of instructions and border radius. And inside of this container, we'll have a H2 heading tag that says click the button below to start the quiz. And underneath the H2 tag, we have a paragraph tag that has a class of padding, and inside of here it will have some sort of instructions. Below the PE tag, we'll have a H3 tag with a class of P2 as well. It says good luck. Below the div container, we'll have a button. With an ID of start button. Type is button. Class of start button. It has padding, margin, and also border radius. And the button, we have a text of get started. In the main quiz container, we'll start a new section. We have a class of main quiz. And this section should end after the footer buttons. So now let's work on the progress bar. So give it a new section with a class of progress container, margin, and also border radius. And inside of this section, we'll give a class of progress bar and padding using the progress tag. Starting value of 0 and a maximum value of 100. Closing progress bar. And below that, we want to have a paragraph tag. And inside of here, we'll have the word question with a span class of current question. Off, we'll have another span class of total questions. Now these numbers are just placeholder. We'll be able to change that in JavaScript later. Now let's move on to the next section, which is the question and answer section. So give it a section with a class of QA container and then padding and margin. And H2 heading. And this one has ID of question. And just any question for now. And then we'll have a div container to contain all the different option buttons. So each button will have its own data index and ID. The type of button, class of padding, border radius, and option. So inside of this button, we'll just add any text for now. So I'm just going to copy these for the other 3 buttons. And then just change the index and ID accordingly. Now let's move on to the next section, which is the footer buttons. We'll use the footer tag with a class of padding and margin. And then we'll have 4 buttons in here with a class of check answer, padding, and border radius. And this button has a type of button. And the text is check answer. So I'm just going to copy this for the other 3 buttons. And then change the class and the text. Let's move on to the last section, which is the score page. So we'll give it a section class of final score. And instead of this section container, we want a div with a class of display score and border radius. And inside of this div, we want to give it a heading of your total correct answers. And below this heading, we want to give the span class of my score. Out of another span class, which shows the total score. This is just a placeholder, and we'll change that later in JavaScript. So below this, we'll give it a h3 with a class of padding. And that says well done. And underneath this div, we'll insert a button. And this button is the restart button. The type of button and the class of start button, because it's the same as the start button styling. And under this button is another button. It's a quick button, so I'm just going to copy that below. Remove the ID and change the class. So that concludes the HTML part. Let's move on to the CSS. Now that we have finished the HTML part, let's start the CSS part. As you can see on line 2, I've imported some Google font that I'll be using for my app. And also on line 6, I have pre-selected some colors that I'll be using later. So the first thing that we can do is give some global styling. Margin 0, padding 0, because by default, browser has some sort of marginal padding. Box sizing to be border box. And the font family to be Roboto that we've imported earlier. Moving on down to the common padding that we've been using in the HTML. So that's padding 2. That's padding of 2%. Same with margin. And the border radius. We'll hide the timer later, just so we can see how it's styled. So we'll move on to styling the text, the headings. Give the color of, pre-select the color. And we move on to styling the main app. Give it a margin of 0 auto, so it's centered. A width of 85%, and you will see it that it's centered after that. The background image that I have pre-selected earlier from Unsplash. And give it a background size of cover and no repeat. And insert box shadow. Now that we're done with that, let's target the header. Display flags. And then we want some sort of space in between. We want a horizontal line below the heading. And we want them to align properly. Now let's style the get started section and also the final score section because they share similar styling. Give it a height of 60 view height. Display flex. And you can see the buttons on the right, so we want to change the direction. We want to make sure that they align properly. So now let's target the child of the get started and final score class. Let's align them and give them a margin of 10% left and right. Now we're going to style the background of the instructions. Give it a background color. Give it a margin bottom of 5%, padding of 4%. And give it some sort of blur effect for the background. We can see there's some sort of blur effect here. Now let's style the start button. Give it a background color in the box shadow. Cursor changing to pointer. See, now it changes. So we want to remove the border of the button. Give it a width of 60%. Margin bottom of 5%. Right now, when we hover over the button, nothing happens. So we want to change the direction of the gradient. So now you can see that it changes. So now let's style the other final score class. View height, and then we will hide that later. Maybe we'll comment that out first. Targeting the score quit class. Now the score class is actually the quit button here. So give it a margin of 0 auto, border style of none, cursor to pointer, and give it a box shadow. Now let's move on to the progress bar. Targeting the progress container, we want to display flags. So right now you see that they're very packed together, so we want some space in between them. Want to align the items to the center. Give it some padding and box shadow and remove the border. Now targeting the progress bar itself. Width of 70%. And give it some color. Now let's move on to styling the 4 options buttons. Want to display flags. Flags direction to column. Give a width of 100%. Give some margin, border style of none. Cursor to be pointer. So changes now. Give it a background color and box shadow. And give it the blur filter. And we also want to make sure that the text inside of here is aligned properly to the left. Now let's move on to the footer buttons, which are these 4 buttons. Display flags again and flags direction to be column. Targeting the button itself. Width of 30%, margin of 2% and auto. Remove the border and give it a box shadow. Now let's target the individual buttons so we can assign some colors for the background. So when we hover over it, want it to change direction. Targeting the next question and finish questions button. Give it a background. And we want to hide them initially. And we also want the gradient for the next question and finish quiz button to change direction when we hover over it, like this, similarly. So we'll do that. So I'm just going to comment that out so you can see that. It changes direction. And targeting the quick quiz button. Yeah, so they all change direction when we hover over them. So right now we want to hide a few things initially. So if we go quiz button, so let's hide the final score. And we want to hide the question page. So perfect. And also we want to hide the timer as well. So that concludes our CSS. I will see you in the next video where we do JavaScript.